Today we are plagued by vivid, lucid, and real visions from the frontiers of dark thought and the darkness of the human experience. We are plagued by teetering lamentations facing the vastness of mental voids, and by the monstrosities and atrocities from which the body and mind attempts to build its history of resilience. Hello everyone, and welcome to quite a different installment of Plagued by Visions, where we explore only the most highbrow and thought-provoking literature out there. My name is Juan, and today I am bringing you a wrap-up video from my escapade into Nonfiction November, which I started in a frantic hurry sometime around the middle of the month, because impulse decisions are what I truly excel at. Now, for those of you who don't know, Nonfiction November is a Booktube initiative which was first established as far as I could tell, back in 2015 by the Booktube channel, A Book Olive, which I will of course link down below. I believe there's a much more formalized version of this reading challenge, and it has prompts, maybe even like a structure as to the kind of nonfiction reading that you are to conduct during this time. But to me, it was more just an excuse to spice up my reading just a little bit, get out of that usual fiction grind and pick up some of the titles here on my nonfiction bookshelf that I have been neglecting for the longest time. And yes, as you can see, I am recording this in front of my nonfiction shelf in order to appear very smart and like I actually know what the fuck I'm talking about. And I'm also wearing a collared shirt and a sweater just to further drive the point home. I'm like really smart, So I mostly just picked the titles that I'm going to talk about at random, although eventually I formed two sort of cohesive themes that eventually I came to find actually shared a lot of theoretical and philosophical threads. And of course, we're going to get into that in a bit. But before I started my reading, I mostly just gravitated towards philosophical texts and then nonfiction testimonials and memoirs by indigenous authors, given that November is also Native American Heritage Month. So I picked 4 books of philosophy and 2 indigenous memoirs. And then after picking these, I sort of started thinking, are these actually nonfiction? I mean, philosophy is not fiction per se. Not in the sense in which literature is marketed, at least, but aren't the theories and ideas put forth by philosophy always just completely fictional suppositions? Isn't all thought a sort of artificial and subjective filtering of the world through an individual's mind? And then I thought, are memoirs nonfiction? I mean, aren't they separate from factual biographies because they're more like biographies imbued by the subjectivity of personal account and a blurring of the facts through heavy pathos? I mean, they're sometimes even purposely mixed together with fictional or erroneous views or suppositions in order to drive the point home that personal history, even when attempting to be factual, is always bound to contain an angle of assumption or personalized recollection. And then I just started thinking, like, what the actual fuck is nonfiction? Isn't all writing fiction to a certain extent? I mean, isn't every written account fictional by the mere virtue of it being a separately encapsulated thread of thoughts that leaves out so much of reality? I mean, what would written nonfiction, actual nonfiction, even look like? It would just look like a jumbled mess, a cacophony of incoherent thoughts. And then following that, isn't all writing non-fictional also? Because it all comes from the material minds of those who write in it, who exist in reality. And then I thought, you know what, fuck it. It doesn't say fiction on the back cover, so that's what we're gonna roll with. So anyway, for the philosophy portion, I decided to stay in theme as the spooky bitch that I am, and I decided to pick out some works that deal with the philosophy of existentialism and nihilism, particularly because I don't know if it's just me, but that's what I tend to think of when it comes to autumnal reads. I mean, autumn is the season where everything starts wilting away and dying, so why wouldn't I cozy up in my autumn sweater and read about Emile Cioran hating absolutely everything? It felt right. So yeah, nihilism and native memoirs, that's what I went with. Let's go ahead and see how the two fit together, or even if they do. So the first philosophical text that I decided to read is not nihilistic per se, although it is certainly a foundational text that influenced that school of philosophy, and there's reference constantly in the school of nihilism, but mostly derisively or contentiously. I do feel that this philosopher is the one that other philosophers love to argue with and bully the most, and it's perhaps by virtue of the fact that he was just too hopeful, and how fucking dare he. I'm talking about Soren Kierkegaard, and the work of his that I read is one of his most revered, which is Fear and Trembling. I won't lie, I picked this one mostly because it was one of the shorter ones on my shelf, but also because Kierkegaard, as I said, seems to be seminal and one of the most renowned starting points from which other paths of thoughts would soon follow. So the first thing that struck me about this text is that it was surprisingly easy to read. Now, while a lot of ideas, I'm sure, just flew over my head, there was a centeredness to the whole affair, and that is mostly due to the fact that the entire work is written in reference to a single scene from the Bible, and so you can always return to that scene in order to recenter your brain into the argument that's unfolding. That scene that Kierkegaard is analyzing here is the biblical tale of Abraham and Isaac. So to briefly recap, the story goes that God asked Abraham to prove his faith to him by sacrificing his only son, Isaac. Abraham seemingly proceeds without hesitation, and he travels to the land of Moriah where the sacrifice was said to take place, and as he's binding and readying his son for death, an angel comes and interjects and goes, whoa, chill bro, it was just a prank. So what Kierkegaard is examining here, very expertly and thoroughly, might I add, is the supposition of just how much anxiety and resignation weighed down on Abraham's mind during those moments as he was about to sacrifice his only son. In examining that scene, Kierkegaard hopes to arrive at an exegesis of the comfort and hope behind faith in something unknown and celestial. And now, as I said, I'm no scholar, so a lot of the theoretical heft probably escaped me, but I was quite captivated by this read, and primarily by the obsessive sort of humanization and exploration of such affect as anxiety and worry in a biblical scene. Something like a scene from the Bible, which is usually represented as these sort of dignified, immovable thing. Of course, Mimesis by Erich Auerbach is something that prominently came to mind while reading this, because here Auerbach, through literary criticism, also attempts to dissect the representation of reality in written form in the Bible, and trying to find some nuisance and warmth in its folds, and I think Kierkegaard does that also quite successfully. So here you really feel the weight and you feel the despair with which he is grappling in this text, and primarily since, as I read, this is supposed to have been written as an indirect way for him to cope with the death of his lover. And the main scene here in Fear and Trembling is of course that vertiginous jump into the void, and you don't know if God's going to catch you or not. And that's where I see those tinges of nihilism, and how Kierkegaard sort of beholds the darkness, even flirts with it a little bit by seeing how Abraham takes this literal leap of faith and resigns himself to losing his son in order to perhaps find some salvation at the other side, which might also not be there. That is, of course, a leap of faith that we all take at some point or another, and it's that feeling of resignation and faith in the unknown, whether spiritual or not, whenever we carry ourselves through harrowing or fearful thoughts, that anxiety. And that anxiety is very palpable here. And here there's also this recognition of isolation, which I also found sort of adjacent to nihilism, and where I can truly see the influence that Kierkegaard eventually had on other schools of thoughts like absurdism. Now, Kierkegaard is fixated on these scenes of Abraham saying nothing to his loved ones about the deed that he is about to carry out, sort of isolating himself in the days leading to the sacrifice as the sole bearer of this event that may eventually lead to his spiritual release or not. And Kierkegaard, I think, is recognizing right there that hope and salvation are these highly meditative and individual affairs. And it's that emphasis on the individual and how meaning and hope can only save a singular I, and for very unique reasons, where I see how he greatly influenced future thinkers like Albert Camus, and on and on and on. Like I said, maybe I didn't get all of it, but overall, I did think it was a wonderful read, a powerful little book, and I'm so happy to have finally read it. And from that very hopeful and moving piece, I jumped straight into the thick of it with The Trouble with Being Born by Emile Cioran. Now, Cioran was a Romanian philosopher, often known as the grumpy old daddy of modern nihilism. And there are even rumors that many young Romanian men took their own lives shortly after reading his works when they were first published, particularly after reading this one. So obviously I had to jump on that ASAP. Now, Cioran or Cioran, I've heard it pronounced both ways. I don't know. I'm probably pronouncing both of them wrong, so forgive me. But I'm gonna go with Cioran, something like that. I think is the original Romanian pronunciation. My Romanian viewers, feel free to roast the shit out of me in the comments. That's what they're there for. Now, Cioran takes after previous thinkers like Nietzsche, of course, and Schopenhauer, and I just wanted to mention that Schopenhauer has been rotting in my TBR for years. So maybe next November. Anyway, Cioran is perhaps the most straightforward of the philosophers that I read this month. He writes in these very sort of pithy aphorisms, which are short thoughts that express just the most angry and disillusioned shit imaginable. So like with Fear and Trembling, this really made for quite a quick read. First thing I have to say about this is that there were some genuinely hilarious passages, and I don't think that was unintentional. I do think that Cioran is approaching the subject matter with a cynicism that really opens up the true absurdity of life and our unstable humors trying to navigate it. For example, there's an aphorism where he's just fucking angry at some seagulls because of how noisy they are, and then he starts throwing rocks at them, and that somehow reaffirms his notion that life is just full of senseless suffering. And then there's another aphorism that's literally just a line long where he just says, fuck the people who write super long letters. And I feel that. And I do think that that's a wonderful and even comforting approach to nihilism. And I think comfort is quite unexpectedly perhaps the best way that I can describe this book. Yes, Emile Cioran's The Trouble with Being Born is the cozy read of 2021. You heard it here first. But really, there is an unabashed sort of even pride with which Cioran carries his emotions and despair that really feels sort of admirable. I don't know. There's just zero negotiation with anything. He's just angry. He's upset. He sees no worth in life, and even death is no comfort. And that's what struck me the most, because see, from early descriptions of his work, I imagined this would be Cioran urging the reader to take his own life as an escape, but Cioran actually grapples with the subject of suicide here, and really sees no worth in it, because to him, it wouldn't be a salvation from life, because nothing is. In that sense, he seems to see suicide as maybe just an optimist's resort to try to regain happiness that they once had. But for him, life has never held this promise of happiness. And that is really quite a liberating notion. So his philosophy seems to be a simple acknowledgement of his despair. And it's an embracing of his emotions without trying to sugarcoat or work his way around them, which surprisingly is 100% in touch with the practice of mindfulness, which I learned about during my brief stint in therapy. And who the fuck needs therapy when you have this? I do. No, but seriously, that's what mindfulness is about. It's about acknowledging, embracing, and then diffusing your emotions, much like he does here. That's what this man is saying. You know, Cioran is saying that we should be in touch with the senselessness of life, that we should really not try to deceive ourselves with temporary diversions, and instead just acknowledge that we're here momentarily for no rhyme or reason, and that embracing that darkness really means embracing ourselves in this weird and ironic way. Anyway, I absolutely love this, and it actually somehow, I don't know, it made me feel less alone, if that makes sense. Maybe this is a bit of oversharing, but I am someone who sometimes struggles with suicide ideation as a result of my PTSD. And so Cioran comes around as this voice of unbelievable empathy and validation. And that proved to be very, very moving and impactful to me. And I cannot wait to read more by him. This was truly something. And now, after Kierkegaard and Cioran, we move away from these philosophical works which try to maybe understand the self, and into works that try to grapple with and fathom the world around the self. And the first of those that I read is In the Dust of This Planet by Eugene Thacker, which is the first of 3 volumes in his Horror of Philosophy series. First, I want to give a quick shout out to Michael K. Vaughan, who always gets all kinds of shout outs here on my channel, and deservedly so. The man is amazing, but this time I want to shout him out because he was actually the one who graciously sent me this book. And I had never heard of Eugene Thacker before, so thank you, Michael, for introducing me to this very peculiar thinker and his equally peculiar work. So this work aims to present a new field of philosophy, I guess, which posits that occult, horrific, and esoteric thought can present us with this unheard of view of the world as a world without us, an existence devoid of human warmth or nuisance, and in which sinister and cold things abound. Now, you might be asking, for what purpose are we being introduced to this school of thought? Well, I don't fucking know. That really seems to be the takeaway here. Thacker is exploring definitely some cool shit in this book. He talks about things like black metal and Junji Ito's Uzumaki, so I was definitely in for the ride. And the prose, although definitely dense sometimes, and sometimes even just drifting in complete disorder, was nonetheless very captivating. And there was an aesthetic sense of darkness and decay that truly felt exquisite and impactful. But again, what is the point of this exploration of the world without us? I don't know. And I suspect maybe there is no point, and that's the point. It's one of those things. I feel like the analyses of works of art expressed here perhaps work less effectively than simply experiencing firsthand the works of art that Thacker is talking about. But nonetheless, his writing feels very incisive, and he clearly has a vision in mind. And I'm just like, I don't know what you're doing, but I'll support you all the way. The ideas do feel a bit scattered, and that might be due to the fact that, like I said, this is volume 1 of 3. So maybe the trajectory of ideas continues and gels better from there, but sadly I'm in this book buying ban, so it will be a while before I can get to those. But that being said, I feel like this work really put me in a mindset which, the more I beheld it, the colder and more horrified I became, and that's what I really think the point of this all was. So Thacker is exploring vacuousness, it's deep darkness, and he's doing the unthinkable with that darkness. He's trying to place human thought in the middle of it. When you read through this for a considerable amount of time, you really start to regard the dark side of non-existence more and more, and so the work just seems to be this inventory of effects meant to push you towards that void and the pits of thought which are forbidden to mankind. And I have to say, at certain moments, when you consider more and more the possibility of a world without us and what that would really look like, a world that is unreachable and unfathomable, it is a truly scary thought. And so I enjoyed this for that alone. And it is a concept that definitely fascinated and intrigued me. So if anyone else has read this, I would appreciate discussing it in the comments below. But sadly, I feel like my discussion of it here is very incomplete, as I simply do not have the sufficient context to truly excavate what is at hand here. But as an exploration of cold and dead affect, I will say it was actually quite brilliant. There seems to be just this infatuation with a pleasurable kind of terror here, which is a very gothic notion, but Thacker is taking that to the heights of sort of like this misanthropic essence of existence itself, and how that can inspire horror, but also this fascination and this weird itch to sort of keep digging and exploring. So in other words, this was cool, if a bit pointless, but I guess it's trying to say that the coolest things are pointless. So that's cool. We're really gripping with philosophy here, aren't we? And finally, the last of my philosophical reads was The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher. And again, like Kierkegaard, not a work of nihilism per se, but the horrors in it definitely share thematic threads with the rest of the stuff that we have discussed so far. Now, I was trying to decide whether I should read this or Capitalist Realism by Fisher for this Nonfiction November, but I mean, come on, that title. how could I resist? This book, I have to say right off the bat, was incredible. I was drawn in fully by Fisher's style primarily, and the way he presents his ideas here. It just kind of flows and then it binds you. So the book has this distinction in the title at its core. You know, what is the weird and what is the eerie? And then what relevance do those phenomena have in our lives? So perhaps I'll say my least favorite part of this work was the part where Fisher endeavors to define and distinguish these two elements. So basically, as he describes, the weird is that which does not belong in reality, or sort of jarringly contrasts against it, whereas the eerie refers to a certain kind of like a stillness almost. It's an absence that suggests something is amiss, or conversely, a presence where there should be absence. He then tries to show how these concepts extend beyond being simple signalers for fear and terror, and instead play prominent roles in our everyday lives. So, of course, fascinating topics, very relevant to my interests. But to my taste, maybe the exposition ran a little too long, especially because it's such a short work, and also because, to me, the most wondrous moments in this work were the analyses and applications that Fisher works into these definitions. Now, of course, with the weird, there's an upholding of Lovecraft's importance, but also Fisher explores the work of David Lynch, which is always a plus. But what Fisher sees most of all is the Lovecraftian, the weird and the eerie as it permeates our current state of existence in these man-made affairs that always haunt us. I was fascinated particularly by his description of money and infrastructure as eerie. These man-made constructs which are so intangible, so vacuous and non-existent, but they hold such real imposing power on us. And again, like with the philosophy of nihilism, we see existence being sort of distended and problematized here as this absurd and unsettling thing that it is. And most enjoyably, Fisher never really condescends. He never really just fills your eyes with jargon. His prose is steady and concise, and he makes for quite a compelling read, even for people who might not be used to reading philosophy. He really lends this feeling of the unheimlich to reality, to a world that is sort of losing its meaning the more that our current system proves to be unstable and flawed. And as we look to the future, sort of attempting to find alternatives to the flawed lives that we live in the present, Fisher really lets us see how eerie the entire affair of the present is. How unstable and strange it is to exist in such an unwelcoming and unnatural way. And all I can say really is a highly insightful, highly recommended, and in particular, if you wish to learn more of the powers of horror and the way in which horror can reveal broader political and existential truths about the self. My go-to recommendation for that was always Kristeva's Powers of Horror. But I think that I am now adding the weird and the eerie into that recommendation. This is truly, truly powerful stuff, and I recommend that you read it. I know it's philosophy, so there's really no spoilers, but I don't want to spoil the experience of uncovering what Fisher has to say here. So I think if you pick up any of the ones that I've talked about, my recommendation is that you have it be this. Now, as I said, I decided to dedicate the second portion of my Nonfiction November reading to Native American texts, particularly memoirs, in observance of Native American Heritage Month. And before I get into those two memoirs that I read, however, I do want to address the fact that I couldn't help but notice that this action seemed extremely tokenizing on my behalf. And it's part of the reason why I chose The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich as my channel's book club pick for December. Because I'm looking to sort of actively exemplify the idea that, hey, we can still read these texts by Indigenous authors past November. We can read them all year long, and we really should. And that being said, I do think that Native American Heritage Month really helped push me towards being more conscious of actively including more reading of this kind in general, since I did feel that I had largely been neglecting a lot of these titles since my college years. Therefore, I am just passing on this gentle nudge that you should consider seeing Native American Heritage Month as a starting point towards seamlessly diversifying your reading and not just this isolated incident being used to satisfy some diversity quota or whatever. Alright, that being said, I do admit it felt a bit jarring jumping from nihilistic philosophy into indigenous writing, as the two seem to be lacking in any cohesion. However, as I read through these texts, I couldn't help but sense that all of this previous philosophical reading really sort of helped prime me for understanding some of the heft that these native authors were trying to communicate in their work. Particularly, I was drawn by a quote from Navajo author Rebecca Roanhorse regarding the affinity that many indigenous authors have towards writing speculative fiction. As she succinctly described her experience as a Native woman, she said, "We've already survived an apocalypse. So maybe speculative fiction comes secondhand to the factual accounts that a lot of these Native authors have." And with this in mind, I really went into this working theory that a lot of those same aspects that Cioran and Thacker and Fisher explored in their philosophical works can be applied to the experiences found in the memoirs that I'm about to talk about. The first one I read was a work of confessional and autobiographical poetry titled When My Brother Was an Aztec by Mojave poet Natalie Diaz. Now, this is a memoir dedicated primarily to the subject of tribal life, and Diaz is coping with her brother's meth addiction. Now, the poetry in this book was incredible, and it's some of the most intense and powerful writing that I have experienced in a while. And in particular, I was drawn to the way Diaz chose to portray several aspects of modern white mythologies through this absurdist and cynical sort of lens. And it's viewing the material reality around her much like Fisher and Thacker as this unwelcoming, abject thing. And this work is where I realized that continuing to follow Fisher's thread of thought, perhaps colonization and the remnants of the post-colonial experience can also be described as eerie in the philosophical sense. For instance, as an example, let me read you one of the poems that I found in here. And this poem is titled Abecedarian Requiring Further Examination of Anglican Seraphim Subjugation of a Wild Indian Reservation. Angels don't come to the reservation. Bats, maybe, or owls. Boxy mottled things. Coyotes too, and they all mean the same thing, death. And death eats angels, I guess, because I haven't seen an angel fly through this valley ever. Gabriel? Never heard of him. Know a guy named Gabe though. He came through here one powwow and stayed, typical Indian. Sure, he had wings, jailbird that he was. He flies around in stolen cars. Wherever he stops, kids grow like gourds from women's bellies. Like I said, no Indian I've ever heard of has ever seen or been an angel. Maybe in a Christmas pageant or something, Nazarene Church holds one every December, organized by Pastor John's wife. It's no wonder Pastor John's son is the angel. Everyone knows angels are white. Quit bothering with angels, I say. They're no good for Indians. Remember what happened last time some white god came floating across the ocean? Truth is, there may be angels, but if there are angels up there living on clouds or sitting on thrones across the sea wearing velvet robes and golden rings, drinking whiskey from silver cups, we're better off if they stay rich and fat and ugly and exactly where they are, in their own distant heavens. You better hope you never see angels on the res. If you do, they'll be marching you off to Zion or Oklahoma or some other hell they've mapped out for us. So you can really see in that poem I just read you that active philosophy of revising history, and revising, of course, a white history in order to reveal the sort of ugly abjection behind some of its most prominent symbols. Of course, religious thought, Western thought being the most imposing thing that came to sever a lot of indigenous tradition and lived experience. And of course, with that came genocide as well. Diaz is really sort of revising that history through a very nihilistic sense. And it's not nihilistic in the sense that it's dismissing the entirety of existence or the entirety of a material reality, but rather, like I said, through that indigenous lens, it's dismissing the material reality that's been forced onto indigenous people. It's sort of using, well, one, language to describe usually heavenly and benign things as angels, and sort of turning them monstrous, unwelcoming, weird, and that sort of weirdness that interjects into what was once the peaceful and unbothered life of indigenous people. It's utilizing weirdness to sort of highlight how unwelcoming the ecosystem has become around which indigenous people have been forced to live. And then there's this language describing monstrosity, like I said. And also there's that nihilism and that acidic humor that I also notice in Cioran's writing being fully at play here, because there's derision, and it comes from a real place of hurt and a real place of recalcitrance and sort of pushing back against traditional notions of the conventional ways in which we see benign things, which are usually white things that, of course, indigenous people don't see as benign at all. And it's that same thread of thought that I think drives a lot of nihilism, and this indigenous memoir really seemed to be in touch with that side of nihilism, with sort of questioning, well, this is a world that is unwelcoming to us. It is an unhealthy environment. It has traditionally been a place of genocide and suffering for us. So why wouldn't we revise it through this cynical and nihilistic sense? And I just thought that it was very powerful, very eye-opening to sort of see the material reality around us being distended again, like it was with nihilism and Fisher's theory of the weird and the eerie, and colonization being this space of eeriness, being this space where there is an absence, and that failure of absence as well, where there should be nothing, where there should only be a vast wasteland from the way that the land was torn from indigenous people. There are born symbols that persist of colonization and suffering. And a lot of this is the endeavor of trying to make sense of those symbols, trying to combat against them, and trying to build some sort of sense of solidarity and resistance through this highly subjective, through this highly personal account of injury and resilience. And it was just magnificent. Highly recommend this work. And then from that, I jumped into the second memoir and the final nonfiction work that I read for this month, and that was Bad Indians, a tribal memoir by Deborah Miranda. Deborah Miranda is a Chumash author, and she is primarily writing from a perspective of the Bay Area in California. And I have to say, this is one of the most thorough exploration of indigenous life and the history of indigenous genocide here in California. And I definitely feel compelled to read more accounts of this kind, and sadly they do seem to be kind of lacking. I mean, indigenous history is something that goes largely unaddressed and unexplored here in California. So I found this work to be invaluable and highly moving and eye-opening. Now, the main perspective that Deborah Miranda is coming from here is the perspective of mission life, the missions that sort of permeate aesthetically even today. A lot of California, California has sort of, in a lot of senses, grown synonymous with this image of the mission. This sort of idealized picture of like these picturesque churches and the sort of culture and the Spanish influence naming that goes on along the coast, that kind of thing. I've certainly witnessed it a lot, and mission aesthetics are something that are still used. They're still sort of replicated to sort of mirror a more traditional California lifestyle, that kind of thing. And that is very strange, because in this work, it's Miranda sort of introducing the notion that that sort of mission lifestyle, that sort of remnants of mission aesthetic that continues to plague California, works as nothing but a reminder of the extensive history of trauma and suffering that was inflicted upon indigenous people. One of the things that this grapples with the most is that concept of identity, and how identity is so problematized because of colonial influence. And identity really sort of seems like this dissonant, ill-defined thing. And identity, Miranda chooses to define mostly through lived experience and what that means, and the kind of solidarity that one can forge from that. because genetically speaking, as Miranda explores here, she is of Chumash and Jewish descent, but there is also some sort of an angle of influence that would lead some to call her Spanish or even Mexican, because, you know, these imposed borders that came about hundreds of years after these people were already living here have really blurred the definitions of what exactly identity is. And identity in California, I have to say, after reading this, really does seem to be this strange and almost undefinable kind of thing that really requires a lot more problematizing and nuance. So I was happy to have found some of that here. And that sort of valuable angle of history that was very valuable for me as somebody who is Mexican, as somebody who sort of presupposes that there is a certain level of a narrative of colonization when it comes to these areas and pertaining to the Mexican people that were already settled here after the U.S. forcefully took the land away from Mexico, and sort of keeping in mind this thread of thought that, well, you know, colonization sort of happened twice over in this area, because the Mexican ownership of California already had its history of colonization way before the United States got involved. And it's this thorough exploration again of the Eerie, you know, strange places, unwelcoming lands, where the ecosystem itself is harmful, you know, where the ecosystem itself is this eerie sort of highlighting of an absence of a once lived life, and it's being replaced by this thing that should not be there. And that's what Deborah Miranda sort of most prominently chooses to explore. And again, you know, it's this narrative of deep acidic and cynical view of the world that California has become. And that is something that I notice Deborah Miranda uses a lot, which is humor, in order to counteract a lot of these painful and almost unbearable narratives. There is a narrative here where a woman was raped by a Spanish colonizer, an indigenous woman, and she sort of takes this as the base of Miranda sort of exemplifying the history that is centuries long of violence against indigenous women that goes largely unaddressed. But all that remains of this account of this indigenous woman that was raped is a brief mentioning in a letter that a Spanish man was writing to another Spanish church owner. And Miranda supposes, you know, there is so much history that is lost, and it's really just an endeavor of trying to piece it together through these highly subjective and welcoming remnants of evidence that were usually written to our detriment. But that sort of narrative, that endeavor to find a history where it has been largely eradicated, is sort of in itself an eerie kind of feeling. And Deborah Miranda certainly seems to think that the lasting indigenous presence in California really does seem to have this tinge of eeriness to it, because it's something that's become highly mythologized and unusual. In fact, she opens up this memoir with a description that is so in line with that sort of Mark Fisher-esque thread of the philosophical definition of the eerie. She describes how she, in her adult life, is traveling to this mission that is still being sort of frequented as this historical landmark. And there she meets a little girl, a white little girl, and her white mother, who are there because the little girl is doing a school project on missions. Deborah sort of introduces herself to the mother and her daughter, and then she sort of says, well, you know, if you didn't know, mission people still exist. I am one of them. That is my heritage. And she notes the look of absolute terror in the little girl's eyes at being confronted by this piece of history that through school, through education, she largely thought was completely non-existent, had been eradicated at this point, and beholds Deborah Miranda as this sort of almost even living dead figure, something that should not be here, something weird in that sense. And that's what this book was really about to me, is that the existence of indigenous sort of mission people in California is largely perceived as a weird existence, an eerie existence, something that should not be there, a failure of absence in a sense. And these sort of embracings of these narratives that have sort of turned indigenous people into these monstrous, ghostly things. Deborah and Miranda remains hopeful through a lot of the time and saying, well, let's embrace this identity of being the other, of being something that should not be here but has remained here. And that act, of being weird and eerie is sort of transformed into being really an act of rebellion and resilience. And it was absolutely amazing. If you live in California, I think that this should be essential reading in order to sort of see that angle of history being told from the ghostly, evanescent perspective of indigenous people, because it is something that is so painfully absent in our narratives and really needs to take more prominence. So there's my sort of attempt at uniting all this reading that I did this month for Nonfiction November. But I really did gain some really powerful insights throughout a lot of the reading. And I hope you did as well, listening to me ramble about it. So that's all I have for my Nonfiction November wrap-up. Do let me know if you've read any of these works. Of course, I'm more than happy to discuss them with you all. I do think that they are fascinating and they are best approached with that level of discussion, of course. So that is pretty much all I have to say. I hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.